Thanks for listening to Baxie's Musical Podcast. If you like what you hear today, be sure to follow it, rate it, like it, share it aggressively with everyone you know. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok for regular updates. Today's episode is brought to you by Metro Chrysler Dodge Jeep and Ram at Chicopee. Be sure to check out their state-of-the-art dealership next to BJ's and Big Y on Memorial Drive, or check out MetroJeep.com and drive home in your new Metro Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram today.
It's Baxie's Musical Podcast.
In August of 2023, I interviewed Andy Chernoff from the Dictators. The Dictators, as I've explained before, were one of the most influential yet sadly overlooked pieces of the puzzle of the early New York underground of the 1970s. This is a band that bridged the gap between the New York Dolls to just about everything else, like the Ramones, the Talking Heads, and Patti Smith, and Television, and the Dead Boys, and Blondie, and everything else in between. In 2020, I spoke to former Dictators lead singer Handsome Dick Manitoba about the band, and by all accounts, the Dictators were among the very first New York bands to pick up where the MC5 and the Stooges left off when both of those bands fell apart in 1973. Their first album, 1975's Go Girl Crazy, is a proto-punk classic. Their next two albums were amazing too. Each of them are a totally essential reckless good time. Since then, the Dictators have broken up and reformed several times. And in 2020, Andy Chernoff put the band back together with original guitarist Ross the Boss Freeman and drummer Albert Bouchard from the Blue Oyster Cult. Their new lead singer was Keith Roth, whose resume has included everyone from the late David Johansen and Sylvain from the New York Dolls to Cheetah Chrome for the Dead Boys, the Runaways, the Damned, Generation X. He's appeared on more than 50 different albums. He's toured with the Ramones and Bon Jovi and what seems like a million different people. And if none of those credits are familiar to you, maybe you know Keith as one of the hosts of Hair Nation and Ozzy's Boneyard on Sirius XM, or any number of radio shows that he's either hosted or produced over the last 25 years. He's also been the co-host of the Rockstrap Podcast, a podcast that has rock and roll legends switching gears and talking about their favorite sports teams. The guy is the real deal, and last week Keith Roth released his very first solo album, The Law of Diminished Return. The first two singles, I Don't Feel Like Thinking Today, and a cover of Curtis Mayfield's Superfly, are absolutely fantastic, and the rest of the album is just as great. And so it's a real pleasure to talk to Keith Roth from the Dictators on Baxie's Musical Podcast.
Thank you for having me a part of this.
No, listen, it's my pleasure. I really appreciate you doing it. I got to tell you, I've been listening to the Jockstrap podcast for the last couple of days with you and Don Jamieson. I listened to the episode you did with Ross the Boss, and also I think I started the one with Eddie Trunk. I freaking love this idea. Rock guys talking to other rock guys about their favorite sports teams. How did you guys even come up with that idea?
Well, I mean, I came up with the idea years ago because, you talk to so many musicians and, and we wound up just talking about sports. The last thing we want to talk about is music, or records and, basketball, whatever it is. And that just seems to be the common verbiage. And then about 20 years ago, longer than that, I kind of put the show in motion. We made a demo of it. It was me and Dave from Skid Row and Jack McDowell, Black Jack McDowell. And we never really got a good deal on it. And I told Don Jamieson about this story, and he said he had something similar with that metal show that they were thinking at some point doing that sports show. And then when we finally got together, we scored something with Pantheon, and they were crazy enough to give us a shot at it. So we've been doing it for almost a year now, and it's a lot of fun.
It's awesome, and I kind of agree with you. It's kind of nice to be talking to somebody about something that you wouldn't normally expect out of them. I mean, a couple of years ago, I did an interview with Elliot Easton from the Cars, and I was talking to him as he was fixing his toilet, and it was like it was perfect. It was like emergency home repairs of Mr. Just what I needed. I'm pretty sure he's never had that in an interview before, and it was fantastic.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty cool talking about Elliot Easton about the weather, but let alone while he's fixing his toilet was pretty damn cool.
Really cool.
maybe you could do the plunge strap or something,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Like emergency plumbing repairs would be, a great podcast. But the only knock I had on it, and it has nothing to do with the show. It has everything to do with the fact that I'm a Boston guy, and to hear you guys talk about New York sports teams. I got to be honest. I have to defend my shitty New England sports teams.
Well, first of all, you don't have shitty New England sports teams. You should check out the one that we did with Frank Domino from the band Angel, because he's a Boston guy, and it was very much about Celtic pride and the Patriots and the Red Sox. And listen, you guys have won a lot of World Series over the last couple of years. The Celtics, winning last year. You want to, I've never seen anything like that with the Patriots. So, and even the Bruins got one since the Rangers. So, your shitty sports teams, I don't agree with you on that. That's for sure.
But that's a Boston inferiority complex, at play. We're so used to seeing like, Wade Boggs and Johnny Damon, Sparky Lyle find themselves in New York, and we just go, "What's going on here?"
So
Yeah.
it bothered you when Wade Boggs was on the horse, jogging around Yankee Stadium.
I felt like I wanted to burn everything I had of Wade Boggs. I wanted to set it on fire and dump gasoline on it and rip my ears off. It was one of those painful things that you hope you never ever have to see again in your lifetime.
Well, I'll tell you what, in 2004, it was crushing, right? But I was not upset about it. People don't believe me. I'm a Yankee fan. And, I've seen the 70s Yankees. I've seen I was happy because I have so many friends that are in Boston. And if you're going to beat us in the World Series, do it that way.
I totally agree with that. It was one of the greatest days of my life. And I'm glad you're not going to take it personally. And I promise I'm not going to bust your balls about it too much.
But it didn't bother me. It's like everybody was like, oh my God. And then we got one after that. People were like, oh, David Ortiz buried the jersey at the new Yankee Stadium. It's a curse now. And there was no curse. And, listen, I have so many, passionate sports talk with Boston fans. And what a perfect way to do it. If you're going to beat the Yankees, come back from 3-0 and beat us. And you did.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one thing, though, to look out for. I know your Celtics are all on a high. I mean, the Knicks are getting their shit together, and I know they've been blowing them out. But if they do play each other, it is not going to be a sweep.
Well,
mark my words on that.
I'm pretty sure you're probably right about that. But I was a 12-year-old kid in 1978, and I remember at 12 years old being reduced to tears watching Bucky Dent hit that home run off of Mike Torres, and it was like one of the most profoundly negative, awful experiences of my life. Where I still, every time I hear the name Bucky Dent, I go through these PTSD reactions.
Are cringing a little bit.
Oh,
yeah, of all people, Bucky. I think he hit 2 home runs as a Yankee. I mean, and or not many, but he did it. I mean, well, hey, the curse of the Bambino said, "Hey, I started with Boston." Let.
So your new album is coming out, the Law of Diminished Return. I love the irony in the title of the record.
It basically says it all, right? Everything feels good when you first start. How about having a drink, right? It's your first 1 or 2, and then the Law of Diminished Returns. Things, you start off here and you drop down. But it was kind of like a play on words and a joke. I mean, with a lot of records, you get off to a good start, and then by the end of it, you're like, Hopefully that's not the case with this record. I'm delusional to think it's not, but it's a title. It's a thing that's always been stuck in my head. So when I had a chance to make a solo record, that was always going to be the title.
Well, I don't think you should feel anything less but incredibly proud of it. The version you did of Curtis Mayfield's Superfly, I think is spectacular. I mean, and I think you'll agree with this. I mean, if you have like no soul or no grasp of funk, the music of Curtis Mayfield is not something you should be fucking around with.
No doubt. No doubt.
You either nail it or you say, let's try Moni Moni again. But you guys did nail it. And my hat's off to you, because I was floored by how really, really good you guys completed that.
Thank you. Thank you. And obviously if it sucked, it wouldn't have been on the record. And people were like, that shouldn't really be your second single, but that's a guy. And his music has been in me since as a young kid. I mean, I don't know if you could see that, but that's my Superfly signed record by Curtis going back to 73, which used to be my brother's and that he gave to me. But, the movie, I mean, and a kid growing up in the Bronx, and, the beauty about growing up in the Bronx was there was no genre thing. You could go to a record store and you could walk out of there with Curtis Mayfield and Aerosmith and whatever, Miles Davis. So, I love the film, I love the soundtrack, and we were just kind of messing with it as we started recording the record. And I got to give credit where credit's due, because the MVP of that track is Bob Pantella, the drummer,
Yeah.
who plays in a band called Monster Magnet. And I've worked with Bob for years, but when he laid down the groove, and then when we cut the vocal and the guitars and stuff, and he added all that percussion on it, and then having the girls sing background vocals, Kingston and Graystar, I was like, man, this is really badass. And if I like it, I don't care what anybody else thinks. I'm just being honest. So,
Well, and especially being a fan of Curtis Mayfield, like you said, I mean, if you're not nailing it, it's time to move on to something else, and you totally did. But I was also impressed with the first single too. I mean, I don't feel like thinking today. I know you wrote that very quickly, so in a very real way, you didn't overthink that song when you wrote it, but it came out great. I mean, it's just a good rock song, well written.
well, thank you. I appreciate it. It was a song. It was one of those things, just turning on the news, flipping through the channels, hearing people fighting about all kinds of stupid stuff, people that used to be friends and no longer friends. And it was just like, I don't feel like thinking today, man. I just want to shut off. And I was like, man, what a great idea for a song. And I literally just came up with that riff, and the words just came out. And then I gave it to the Dictators, and they were like, oh yeah, it's more you. And I'm like, yeah, it is more me. And and that was and I needed an opening song for this record, so I thought it fit good, but it was really no overthinking on it. It was one of those songs that
Yeah.
it was really written in like 3 or 5 minutes.
Well,
You know.
I'm glad you transitioned into the Dictators, because about 2 years ago, I interviewed Andy Chernoff,
Okay.
and this is just about the time of the release of Crazy Horses. And in fact, I actually talked to Albert Burchard on my radio show about a week before I talked to Andy, and I showed Andy this, and this is one of my proud achievements. I actually own the Osmond Brothers Crazy Horses album, and as you can see, it's been beaten to death over the years. But I love I love that song, and it's so funny how excited the two of them were to have tackled that song, and then and again it came out great. To be involved with guys like Andy and Ross the Boss. How did you even get involved with these guys? I mean, of all bands to attach yourself to, how awesome is that?
It's okay. No, I'm just kidding around. Well, the weird thing is there's a connection with the Dictators and myself, because my middle brother actually went to kindergarten with Handsome Dick Manitoba, aka Richard Blum, and Scott Kempner, top 10. So
Yeah.
I've known those guys through the neighborhood since I was a little kid. And Andy thinks I'm lying to him, but the first record I bought with my own money, I did have records before that. My brother's hand-me-downs, because he's got weird OCD. If there's a little scratch or blemish, and a lot of times I would scratch his records because I know I'd get them. But and I got records as birthday gifts. But I was at Alexander's on Fordham Road in the Bronx, and my mom's like, you could buy her. Oh no, I had my own money for my birthday, and I see Manitoba on the cover, with the wrestling thing, and I'm into pro wrestling at that point, watching Saturday Night Superstar Billy Graham and the guys from the neighborhood, and I just took a chance on it, and I came home with it, and hearing Master Race Rock and Next Big Thing, and I loved it. And then years later, starting to play music, my band Frankenstein 3000 opened for the Dictators several times, and I had done stuff musically with Albert. As a matter of fact, when they had the Dictators NYC, Dean Rispler couldn't make a gig, and they did Go Girl Crazy in its entirety. And I was actually Manitoba who suggested I could fill in on a week's notice because it was a good paying gig.
Sure.
And I played bass on it. So I've known them for a long time. And I think when Andy and Ross decided to get the band back together with Albert, they had cut Goddamn New York and Let's Get the Band Back Together. They realized they needed a singer. And at that point, Scott Kempner's, sadly, the dementia had gotten to the point where he really, when they were cutting those songs, realized that he really couldn't do this full time. So Albert had recommended me, and Ross was like, that's not a bad idea. And Andy goes, oh, the DJ, and but I went down, auditioned with them at Smash. We spent an afternoon playing some old songs, and it worked out really well. And that's really how it got rolling. So it's been 3 years. I think we've done 4 or 5 tours already. We've done a lot of shows. Really proud of the record. But a funny story about Crazy Horses, though, is we were doing a Canadian tour, and we, it just came out, the single, digitally. And by the way, that's going to be on our next record, because we're putting together like an odds and sods re-recordings of older songs, new songs, and that'll be on there. But so, we're in Canada, and we're playing the first night in Toronto at the Horseshoe Tavern, and we're in the dressing room, and we're getting ready to go out there, and the opening band did Crazy Horses. Like, and we're like, okay, well, we're not doing that. I guess that cool idea, is caught on. But I did have that Osmonds record as well.
Yeah.
I could dig it out for you. Oh, what a great album, right? Osmonds listening to Sabbath, and boom, right?
One of the most bizarre records I own, in the fact you would never in a million years think the Osmonds would be listening to metal, but that's exactly what it took to get them to do that. I actually also have an album which I think is maybe the most ironic record I have. It's Ray Charles doing a version of "I Can See Clearly Now," which I think you.
I never heard that one. I would love to hear it.
It's fantastic. I mean, well, first of all, it's Ray Charles, so he's never going to do anything terrible, but it's unbelievable. But Crazy Horses, what a great song for the Dictators to do. And I think one of the things I loved about the Dictators, and you can go through those first three records, and there's lots of examples of this, is they were such a great band, but they didn't take themselves overly seriously. And it's interesting to me that in a real way, the Dictators, I think, get a little bit overlooked. And I don't know if it's just a matter of timing or what it was. I mean, you in New York and the underground scene back then, you're coming off the New York Dolls. You're still kind of a couple of years away from CBGBs and the Ramones. I mean, the Dictators hold a pretty, important place, but yet for whatever reason, they have gotten a little bit overlooked.
I agree with you. I mean, they were the first, if you really think about it, outside post New York Dolls. Here's a band that really put out a great punk rock record. And obviously the Ramones were fans, and obviously, the Dictators doing California Sun, before the Ramones, but, in New York City, it caught on, and more so over in Europe. But I agree, I mean, kind of like the Stooges finally got their day. It took 30 years for people to really discover the Stooges and, the MC5.
Yep.
And after the fact, sadly, with this Hall of Fame thing, with not one guy being able to experience it. But yeah, the Dictators, Andy always thought out of the box. It was alternative rock. It was punk rock before it had labels. And, that record was monumental. It was heavy. It was punk rock. It had a great sense of humor, I mean, and hearing those songs and those lyrics, I mean, I thought it was written about, my neighborhood in the Bronx, but Andy's from Queens. So, but yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And think about, AC/DC, their first show in New York, opening for the Dictators and doing that. There's a lot of history there. People do recognize it, but I think it was Morrissey who said that, like with the New York Dolls, he was the one that kind of got them back together. It takes 30 years for people to understand bands that are ahead of their time. So hopefully, maybe now that I'm part of the band, people will recognize it and we get some more accolades,
Well, I don't think you're wrong about that. I do think that time is kinder to some of these bands. I mean, I remember there was in high school, there was like one kid in high school. This is like in the early 80s. One kid knew who Iggy Pop was. And that was it. Nobody did. I mean, I lived in a town where like the Cars were considered a punk band.
Right.
That's really what it was back then. But these bands, when you think about the level of influence, it's remarkable. I mean, and you have a pretty unique perspective on it, maybe more so than a lot of other people, because I mean, you've not only played with the Dictators, you've played with the late David Johansen, you auditioned for the Ramones. I mean, there aren't a whole hell of a lot of people that can say that they've touched all those pieces of real estate. But tell me a little bit about that, and especially about David Johansen, since he just died earlier this month.
I mean, what's really kind of strange. Well, there's a couple things. One is the Dictators. We were doing dates that week, and are doing support for us was Steve Conti, who was a New York Doll for many years, and Steve has been a friend of mine. I met him when I was like 17. So I've known Steve for a lot of years, more years than I care to remember. But we were playing this show up in Woodstock, New York called The Colony. And a lot of people in the crowd were wearing the David Joe Sweet Relief shirts. So after the show, I rounded up some of them and I took a photo and I texted it over to Mara, his lovely wife. And she had told me the news that he had just passed. And it was really heart-wrenching because when I saw him, a couple of weeks before that, I went there with the expectation that it was the last time I was going to see him. But when I left there, it wasn't my expectation anymore, but it was the last time I saw him. He was in bed and, but he looked great physically, his face, his hair, he looked amazing, he looked gorgeous. And, and what happened was, David's been sick for a while, but he kind of had that in check. And then he fell down and he broke his back. And they thought that was going to be it. And they had kind of put him in a hospice care at home. But then they took him out of hospice care because his back had healed. And when he was laying in bed and he got up and he walked over to me to sit at the table, it was one of the most powerful things I've ever seen. And we were talking about, maybe, him performing again. And and it was really a great day. And I left there, like, we're going to go see him again following Saturday. And then I guess shortly after we left, he took a turn for the worst. And that was the last time I saw, but it was ironic that Steve was out with us. So we were able to pay tribute. The Saturday gig that we did after that was like a funeral. It was so hard to do that show. And then the final show in Long Island was more like a celebration of his life. But knowing David as well as I do, he wouldn't want anybody to be down. Like, he's not one of those kind of guys. Think about his album titles. One Day It'll Please Us to Remember Even This. And David would tell you, it was basically, when we're walking around with coloscopy bags, and he goes, and me and you sitting around talking the stupid shit. He goes, one day it'll please us to remember even this. It was his thing. But, having the honors of working with that guy for 23 years and playing music with him and producing his show. And the one thing I'm blessed to know is we all know he's an icon, but he had a heart of gold. And he was really one of the greatest people I've ever met, and one of the greatest experiences. And he was so multi-talented, one of the smartest guy, always the smartest guy in the room. And he loved people, not so much entertainers, but he loved people. You know what I mean? He goes, I get a kick out of some of these guys, man. They put 3 chords together, and they come up with a melody and they think their nose is connected to God. Like, he was always grounded.
Yeah.
People don't know that about him. He always appreciated the good times and the bad times and was able to roll with it. I think that's what you kind of asked, right?
Yeah, no, that is. And it's a really cool answer, than the fact that you had such a close relationship with him, because I mean, he was the last guy standing. And in a lot of ways, I mean, the Dolls were maybe the most unlucky band of all time. A lot of their problems were self-induced by Johnny, and absolutely, and a lot of those things have taken a lot of great talent away from us. But that brief period of time for the Dolls, again, much like we talked about the influences of a band like the Stooges or MC5, I don't think you can ever overstate how important that band was to people. Especially since they broke up years ago. But I mean, but still, 2 records, and people still completely adore what those guys had done and who they were.
Yeah, I mean, when I first saw them on Don Kirshner's rock concert, I mean, I was floored because I love the Stones, and I'm like, this is a little bit more edgier, and it was great, And then you speaking of the Dolls, I had the honors of playing with Sylvain. I knew Sylvain for a long time, and what they did and how important they were. And getting back to the Stooges for a second, where I grew up in the Bronx, in that area, like 80th Avenue and off of White Plains Road, and that little niche of territory over there, everybody was into these bands. So when I moved to Jersey and, meeting some friends, and I was like, hey, are you guys into the Stooges? And they're like, what, Larry Moe and Curly? They had no idea. It wasn't until I was like 16 or 17 going to the Court Tavern in New Brunswick and hearing like TVI on the jukebox. I'm like, wait a minute, that's the Stooges. I thought I moved into and people did catch on. But, what the Dolls did, they laid the foundation for bands that, the Velvet Underground could be said the same. All the people that became musicians saw them and realized how important they were. And then they kind of did what they did and got all the accolades.
Well, you said it yourself. It seems to take like a 30-year block of time before people start to really appreciate a band. And this would be the perfect example for this is when the Dolls appeared on the Old Grey Whistle Test. And and at the end of their performance, Bob Harris, the host, refers to them as mock rock. It was like the most dismissive, diss ever. It's like you look at that now and you say, what a dick that guy is.
But the funny thing is, I bet you Johansen got a kick out of it.
I'm sure he did.
One time we were walking and somebody came up to him and said, "Hey, David, we just heard you. We were just at a wedding, or we were at a bar mitzvah, and they played Hot, Hot, Hot." And David put his hand on his shoulder. He goes, "I am so sorry." He used to refer to it as his smash shit. But the weird thing, people knew him for the Dolls and for the movies and stuff like that. But making fun of it. It never bothered him. It really never bothered him. And yeah, for him to say that, it was kind of, well, people just said, he basically said, I'm a dick by saying something stupid like that. I bet he regretted it down the road, though.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's just
He just didn't get it.
no, and again, yeah, that would have been true of any number of bands that came out, in the '70s and had real important, the Sex Pistols, the Damned. I mean, even the maybe less so the Clash, because I think they were a little bit more mass appeal than the others. But I mean, you go back and look at those bands now, and you say, well, this wasn't so bad after all, and it wasn't so dangerous to begin with.
No, you listen to that Pistols record, and it's just one of the greatest rock and roll records ever made.
Yeah,
I mean, I once my buddy Michael Alago. Do you know Michael Alago?
I do. Yeah, I've interviewed him. Yeah.
So, yeah, and I interviewed John on the phone doing electric, and he wasn't the most friendliest guy on the planet. So I was Michael Alago's date for his birthday, and he said, we'll go see Public Image Limited. And we went to the show. It was great. And after the show, I saw some friends at the gig, and I'm hanging out, and he goes, come in the back and say hi to John. And I said, listen, Michael, never meet your heroes, man. I talked to this dude on the phone. He goes, you come back there with me. And I tell you what, I met one of the nicest, sweetest, best times, 5 hours with John. And we were talking about Black Sabbath, Alice Cooper, stuff you would not imagine. He was into latter-day Black Sabbath, like Ian Gillan. He was like, Born Again. And it was one of the best nights ever. And we were talking about the Pistols and how it was so dangerous at that point, but it really wasn't. It was like he was a big Alice Cooper fan, and that's where he wrote from that, the heart. I don't even think he hates Pink Floyd anymore, but it was, when you listen back to it, it really, the Ramones, they were like the Beach Boys on steroids. It was, but it did really feel dangerous back then, and that's why I enjoyed it so much.
See, again, I lived this sheltered existence until college, and that's when I started to discover this stuff. But in high school, I mean, you remember the '80s and you remember the '70s. Like a parent would rather have their kid be a drug-addled, jobless loser than have him be a punk.
Punk rock guys were always the smartest guys in the room too. I mean, it's like they knew how to. They had a great sense of humor, and I mean, like. That's a really interesting question. Like when you say drug addict, are you referring to like bands from back then, or
it could have been anybody? And you'd rather have your kid be a drug addict than be listening to punk rock. I mean, it's like the worst thing that can happen to your kid.
And you talk to so many people in government, or if you know people in government, they love the Clash. They grew up on the Clash. They grew up on a lot of this stuff, I mean, but now all of it is so accepted, I mean, being at Barbados Gallery and, it became like the Dolls did their record release party there. And this is a place I threw up in the bathroom. And now it's like this real chic, people paying like all this money for suits. And it became very commercialized, it's weird. But it was a great time of music. I mean, we grew up in that. I think we're kind of around the same age, judging by when you said you saw Bucky Dent with the home run. So I think we're right there. You might be a little bit older than me. But
that's okay. I don't mind sharing my my memories of my damaged youth with you.
But to me, '81 was the end of rock and roll. I mean, everything has been cool since then. There's a lot of great bands that came out, but to me, that was the last year of originality. Because I've yet to hear something after that was newer than '81, except maybe like electronic techno, but a lot of the grooves are based on the stuff. And, with the Dictators, a lot of the bands, like we went out and toured with the Damned twice. And there's a lot of love and respect between both bands because, Paul and Captain Sensible all had those Dictators records. They all owned Blood Brothers and Go Girl Crazy. So it was really a great run, and it was a great package with that. So once again, going back to musicians that discovered, it was like guys like you that really searched out cool stuff. And, we were the in part of the out crowd, right?
It's absolutely true. You got to tell me about auditioning for the Ramones and what that was all about.
It was the first time I played in a band that was good. I mean, I'm being honest with you. I mean, the quick story of it, my buddy Dave Halpern, if he ever happens to see this, was somehow spent a weekend with Dee Dee Ramone. And Dee Dee, he said, was starting this band called Sprocket, and that he told Dave he's quitting the Ramones. So me, thinking like, ooh, Dee Dee's out of the band. I know every Ramones song. That's only band I could be in at a professional level at that point in my career. That's how I played. I played bass and guitar, took the first Ramones record, turned it one way, learned how to play bass, turned it the other way, played guitar. So I called the management company, Gary Kerr first. And I get the number, and now I didn't realize I had top secret information. So the receptionist answers the phone. I'm 21 years old, 20 years old. And I'm like, listen, I heard that Dee Dee Ramone is quit the Ramones and I'm your guy. I had that kind of chutzpah, right?
Right.
And the girl goes, can you hold on a second, please? And Gary Kerfurst gets on the phone with me. He goes, and I told him my name was Keith. And he goes, hey, Keith, how you doing? So what are you talking about Dee Dee quitting the, and I told him the story. And I added a little spice, and my buddy Dave said I'd be perfect for the band. So he goes, well, let me get your name and number. And if there ever is auditions, and he's like, it's really not announced yet. I mean, this was like brand spanking new. So I kept following up, might even call. And then finally they said, listen, there's a cattle call of auditions at SIR. And when you come down there, and they're like, can you show up around 7 o'clock? And I seriously said to him, AM or PM? And he laughed. He's like, they'll enjoy your sense of humor. I was dead serious. But anyway, I show up, and there's a bunch of people in the hallway, and including CJ, who was like AWOL. He's sitting there with Ramones records. He just wanted to get them signed. He didn't expect to get the gig. And I came in and I played with them. And about halfway through the first song, I can't remember what the first song we do. We wound up doing a bunch, but I started laughing because at that point it was Marky and Johnny. And I look over, and I sound good. I know I'm nailing it. And I start laughing, and Johnny goes, well, what's so funny? And I said, dude, you're like my favorite band. And I look over, and there's Johnny Ramone and Marky behind me. And they were kind of like relieved, and then I played a bunch, and they didn't it was like, hey, they would call out the song 1, 2, 3, 4. If you didn't know it, you were gone. So I did a bunch of songs. They took my number down, and then I got another call to come back. And Monty Melnick, who Monty, their manager,
Sure,
told me I'm one of like 3 or 4 that were actually got a second audition. So I went back for the second audition, and Joey was there. He wasn't happy, missed Dee Dee, but I did a second audition, and Monty said, look, we'll call you next week and let you know what the deal is, like maybe even in. And I'm thinking like, whoa, it was a brutal 4 days of thinking like, could I be a Ramone? And but I didn't get the call, but I did become friendly with all of them after. And when I started doing radio, I was able to get Joey down there and Johnny, and it really motivated me. And as a matter of fact, my band after that, we got to open for the Ramones, and it's kind of Joey was such a great guy. And so that was really my first time. And then after that, I made sure that I was like, I had my shit together and started some pretty cool bands. But I never played in a band that sounded good until I played with the Ramones. And it was a great experience. And, me and Monty had talked about it, especially when we played Joey Ramone's Bash. And that was, I guess, in 88 or something like that, 87. I can't remember when, but it was just a luck of, and there's a documentary that's coming out where I kind of talk about all that stuff.
So when you don't get the gig and CJ winds up getting the job instead of you, I mean, are you the kind of guy that said, "Oh yeah, they sound great," or were you the kind of guy that says, that guy, "I'm better than that guy"?
No, I didn't say that. CJ was more seasoned. I mean, he was a little older. He, and I think he brought a lot of fun to them. I mean, and I would have done the same thing as well because me and John, when we talked, we talked Yankees. He's a big hardcore Yankee fan, and we talked sports. And me and Joey always wound up talking about Cheap Trick. He loved Cheap Trick so much. I love Cheap Trick. So those were the basis of our conversations. As a matter of fact, when my first daughter was born, my wife used to bartend. And on Saturday nights, Joey knew when my wife went to work. And I would get those calls, and I'd see the Jeff Hyman on my caller ID. And if I got on the phone with him, I would talk to him sometimes till she came home from work, just talking music. And some nights I didn't pick up because it's an undertaking, and I regret not picking up every time. But so I would have had some fun with those guys, being in the band. I mean, I never really met Dee Dee, except for like a quick like handshake or having them sign something. But I felt like I got to know Joey and Johnny really well, and they were great guys. But CJ did an amazing job, and he was the right guy for the job. And I would have been extremely green, and I was just kind of learning the craft at that point. But that did inspire me to really take it seriously, and also for me to believe that I can do it. And that was so I took the positive out of it. But first couple of days after that was kind of devastating, to be honest.
I would imagine
if you're that getting
so close.
That kind of close, yeah.
So
yeah.
it's funny to hear you talk about the fact that they loved Cheap Trick. I mean, when you listen to the Ramones now, when I hear those songs, I mean, I hear great power pop type rock and roll songs, and not the kind of thing that in 1981 parents and their kids were showing up on Donahue to talk about. I mean, it wasn't it was it
Yeah,
wasn't
I
that.
remember that shit too. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Right.
absolutely. But like Cheap Trick at that time, like those first two albums are fantastic. I mean,
First three to me.
first three. But I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm more partial to the first one. I could listen to
Yeah,
that
me too.
record all the time. And actually, it's funny because if I'm noticing on the wall, I'm noticing on your shirt, the Red Cross. And
Yeah, I love Red Cross.
I talked to
Oh,
this,
here's a quick funny story. So I go see Red Cross over the summer. They're playing Eagle Hall in Jersey City, right? And I hadn't seen, and the last time I saw them was when they played Maxwell's in Hoboken, and they were phenomenal, phenomenal. But during their set, they played Crazy Horses. So a few people in the crowd, from the Dictators came over and like, dude, they're covering you, man. They're covering you. And I'm like, no, I didn't want to get into it, but it was like they played Crazy Horses that night too, as well.
That's
But
great.
yes, I love Cross. What another band that should have been a household name.
So I talked to Stephen McDonald just a few months ago. I mean, and I'm so glad that the band, all of a sudden is getting the recognition 30 years later that we talked again, another example of exactly that. They get the movie and the book and that last album, the Red Album, is so freaking ridiculously good. And it's like, you're absolutely right.
Best ones.
Yeah.
They're researching the blues is like, oh, Red Cross is making a record, and I love Phase Shifter and I love the Show World and, Teen Babes from Monsanto. I loved all those records. I'm like, all right, I got to buy the new Red Cross. And I really thought there'll be a couple good tunes on there. And at that point, I thought it was their best record they ever made. And, and the last album, just pop, infectious, just great songs, great songwriting. The guys are great players. And,
Yeah. I mean,
and they're still as good now as they've ever been.
I totally agree with you. To come up with like 18 of the best songs you've ever written all at once in the end.
Double album.
Yeah. This deep into your career is amazing to me. So I want to ask you about your radio career here for a minute, because I'm a longtime radio guy. I mean, you hosted a show, the Electric Ballroom in New Jersey, for a good period of time. You've been on Sirius XM. How did you get into radio?
It was funny because if you would have asked me, I started doing radio in October of '98. If you would have asked me in September of '98, would you ever do radio? I would laugh at you. But ironically, you just don't know how things shake out. So there was a girl named Amy Christie. She was a publicist. And I was in a band back in the early '90s, and she came out and did a story on us. And really cool girl. And I knew her from the New York scene. And she had a magazine. And she wound up moving down to Jersey. And I was living in Jersey in Long Branch at that point. And she said to me, there's a new radio station opening in Jersey called The Rat, and they're still there. And she goes, I talked to the president, the general manager, and I pitched him an idea of doing a radio show. And I thought about a co-host, and I thought you'd be great because, you know music. It's kind of like if me and you were talking. It's not, these are the conversations I had with Amy. So she said, would you be into, and my first reaction was like, and I had heard the station. I'm like, I'm not really into back selling corn and Memorial Day weekend, 9 in a row. I mean, I just wasn't into that. And she said, no. Between who and I know, we could bring down guests. We could play whatever we want, as long as it doesn't have curses. And I said, okay. So she said, come up with a playlist. And we walked into a meeting. And I mean, can I be honest with you? One of those meetings where you show up where you could know you're not getting this gig and you could give a fuck. But I just got out. My daughter was just born. She was in one of these things, and they were around this big table. And I wrote out my playlist of songs, and I put my daughter right in the middle of the table, and I threw it down. And the great Dan Finn and Carl Kraft were there, and we started explaining. And I'm like, this might be kind of serious, but I still didn't think it would happen. And Dan goes, I know this may sound crazy, but I want to give this a shot. And I'm like, really?
Wow.
And they're like, how about we start whenever? It was a couple months out, and we did. And the first night on radio, I showed up with a 12-pack of beer, and everybody's waiting to meet these new idiots that are going to be on radio that never did radio. And a lot of people hated us, like really hated us, because they went to school for it, and we were just not taking it serious. But I thought you could drink on the air, so strike one. And then we get on the air and we're talking, and the next thing we mention is Howard Stern, who's competitive radio to them.
Sure.
Strike two. And I'm like, I'm not going to make it through my first 20 minutes on the air. but we did, and it wasn't a great show, and it took a couple of weeks. But then shortly, we had our good buddy Joey Ramone come down, and then we had Alice Cooper join, and Joey would interview Alice, and then we had John Paul Jones, we had the Cheap Trick guys, and David Johansen, and coming down, and John, and it just blew up, and the press gave us a lot of notoriety, and we were just talking like two guys sitting at a bar.
Yeah.
We knew no radio etiquette, and I'll say it all day, and and it worked. And then shortly after that, I got a call from Sirius XM about doing a punk show called the Punk Yard, and I liked the idea of it, but I didn't know what satellite radio was. I thought it was like Wayne's World, and it was in the city, and they're like, well, you could do a weekend on Left to Center, or alternative rock. And I had no idea what they were talking about. But when they said the money, it was worth it for me to come in the city and do the show. So I'm like, you know what, I'll go up there. And it was only going to be one day a week. And when I walked in and I went up the elevator and I saw the corporation through the glass, and I see Meg Griffin, Carol Miller. I don't know if you know who these people are. They're New York legends. Pat St. John. I'm like, I better educate myself quickly on it. And I believe that was in either 02 or 03. And thank God, at that point, I took radio serious, and and that's how I got into radio.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not easy to have a lengthy career in it, but you have, and that's it. You have to. I mean, I have to congratulate you on it, because I mean, I do know the challenges of working with it and in it, and then having longevity in it. It's not easy to do.
No, I mean, and then going up there, and I mean, now I'm on Ozzy's Boneyard. Hey, look, I grew up with Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith, so I knew all that stuff. The Hair Nation thing, initially, I thought they put me in radio purgatory, because I wasn't. I mean, I'll be honest, I wasn't a fan of really much of it. I liked Poison. I admit that. I liked the first record because they reminded me of the New York Dolls, and and I loved Hanoi Rocks, and of course Guns N' Roses. But that's all I really knew. And then when I got into it, it was like seeing it, like after it was the heyday of it was done. Because sure, some of my friends were into it, but I never bought those records. And then except maybe for a couple of few that rose to the crop, and really discovering how great a lot of those bands are. Not all, but a lot of those bands are, and then meeting them, and they're some of the nicest folks. So I've been doing that for a while. I really enjoy doing Hair Nation, and I just got off the Monsters of Rock cruise. I've done 5 years in a row. I've done 7 of them, out there with Michael Monroe, having a good time, and LA Guns, and it's such a dedicated fan base, and there's all such wonderful people. But, the other thing about radio is obviously working with David Johansen for 20 plus years, producing his show. And that's, that was one of the greatest experiences of my life. And to have him, not only from that led to me being a member of the David Johansen group, getting to play some music with him and doing shows, and recording with him. He actually recorded Babylon with my band Frankenstein 3000, which was such a highlight for me as a musician to have, even though I'm working with him, to have David Johansen come in the studio and cut a Dolls track with us. And then him after the session saying, hey, the Dolls are getting back together. I'm like, what? Because he was doing the Harry Smiths at that point.
Yeah.
And he goes, yeah, Morrissey is curating this event and he wants the Dolls to get back together. And he asked me to keep his own lyrics after he just sang it and knocked it out of the park. And that was started another 15 years. But the moment, so I was, one of my favorite things of radio was working with David. And, as my story gets longer and longer.
You mentioned the Monsters of Rock cruise. The Dictators are going to be on a cruise coming up in May, the Little Steven's Underground Garage cruise. I looked at who's on that lineup, and I'm thinking, oh my God. First of all, I've talked to a bunch of these people on the podcast and interviewed a lot of them, and I'm thinking, just to be a fly on the wall to some of the people on this lineup, Social Distortion, X, the Flaming Groovies. I don't know if you ever met Cyril Jordan. That guy can spin stories like nobody. Lenny Kaye.
I'm hearing that Cyril may be doing something with us, but I'm just kind of sprinkling that out there.
Really?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it just sounds like this is going to be a real fun cruise, and again, to be a fly on the wall in some of the conversations has got to be absolutely incredible.
No doubt. I mean, I'm looking forward, because when I do the Monsters of Rock cruise, I don't go out as a musician. I go out as a host, which is fun. I mean, and I do get up and play with some of the bands, and we have some jams and whatnot. But to go out and just play and just concentrate about playing, 3 great Dictator shows, I'm really looking forward to that. And as you mentioned, some of the bands, and I know one night we're doing the Go Girl Crazy record in its entirety, which we've yet to learn as of March 17th, but we hopefully we'll be all right by that point. And yeah, so I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm seeing a lot of those bands, as you mentioned, Flamin' Groovies and Palmyra, and Steve Conti will be on there with his band, and man, Social Distortion, Helicopters. It's going to be a great cruise.
That's
and
awesome.
It's going to be why don't you jump on, man? Little Steven's cruise is going to be great.
Well,
I think it's
if I could peel myself away from my radio job, I'd be happy to do it. But I'm not sure I can get away with that. But no, it does sound like a lot of fun though. But the new album is coming out, The Law of Diminishing Return. I can't wait for it to come out. I've really enjoyed what I've heard so far. Keith, this has been a blast talking to you. I really appreciate the time
you too,
today.
man.
Yeah,
really good. I feel like you're one of those guys. You meet some people and you feel like you know them, your whole life. And I'm really excited about the record. I don't know when this is airing, but it's one of those records that I'm really happy with. So I made myself happy. So I hope other people like it. But it's a cool journey. There's a couple covers on there. Superfly, and we tackle a Lou Reed song. Real quick with Ross the Boss. I wanted him on the album, and Punky Meadows, the guy from Angel, a great guitar player. I had the honors of playing with the Punky band for a little bit, but him and Danny are on there. Albert Bouchard plays drums on a couple tracks, but the album was done, and I was done writing, and I'm like, man, how do I get Ross on there? And him, to see him play like the BB King stuff and the stuff he was weaned on, and we both love Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, so we tackled Strawman and just let Ross shine on those BB King riffs that he played.
Wow.
And I'm so glad that made the record literally at the last minute.
That's
so
great.
It's pretty cool.
Great. Keith, best of luck to you. I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you, man.
And if you're ever around, love to talk to you again sometime.
You're in Boston, right?
Actually, Western Mass, Springfield.
Oh, well, we're going to be back there soon. Last time we were up there with the Damned at Live Tonight, but I'm hearing rumblings that we'll be back there. So please come out and see the Dictators.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you.
We'll put
Keith.
you on the list.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you. Have a good day, man.
You too.
Cheers. Nice seeing you, man.
The name of the new album from Keith Roth is called The Law of Diminished Return. It's now available wherever you find music. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you can always email me at bax@rock102.com. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks again to Metro Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram at Chicopee for their support. But most of all, thanks to all of you for listening to Baxie's Musical Podcast.